never asked for forgiveness. He never said, "I love you." But when I saw him in that coffin, I cried. And it was in that crying that I discovered that sometimes forgiveness is not about the other person. It's about freeing yourself. This story will touch your heart deeply. And maybe, like me, you'll also understand that monsters aren't always born monsters, and how we survive those who hurt us, and how sometimes survival is also a form of love. Before we dive into this breathtaking journey, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you are listening to our story from, and prepare to be moved. That morning, the sky was grey. It wasn't raining, but there was a humidity in the air that clung to your skin like an uncomfortable silence. The kind of day that seemed to not want to exist. I parked the car on the side street of the old church where the wake would be held. I stood there for a few minutes with my hands still on the steering wheel, staring at the cracked facade of the chapel. The wooden sign above the entrance creaked in the wind. I wondered why I had come. For years, I had longed for this moment to come. I thought that when it did, I would just feel light, free. But now, sitting in the car, my breath felt like lead in my lungs. I looked up and saw a man in a dark suit coming in from the side. His shoes made a hollow sound on the stone floor. For some reason, that sound took me back to a distant memory. The first time I saw my father cry. I must have been about 7 years old. He was sitting in the kitchen, leaning on the table with his head in his arms. He was crying silently. I was afraid to make any sound that would remind him I was there. His crying scared me, because he was the man who screamed, who hit, who threw dishes at the wall. Seeing that man broken was like watching a mountain crumble. I entered the chapel with hesitant steps. People glanced over their shoulders at me, some faces vaguely familiar. Uncles I hadn't seen in decades, cousins who might not even recognize me. In the center of the room, the closed casket was surrounded by wreaths of flowers. The dark wooden lid seemed too heavy, as if it held not just a body, but an entire past packed and sealed. I approached slowly, not because I wanted to see, but because I had to. My heart was beating like a drum out of control. I stood there for long seconds. My reflection trembled on the varnish of the coffin lid. A part of me screamed to turn away, another to say something. I said nothing, I just breathed. Until suddenly, I felt my throat close up, and my eyes began to burn. And it was there, in front of the inert body of that man I hated so much, that my tears came, without warning, without permission. And then I cried. It wasn't a pretty cry, it was restrained, almost ugly. I pressed my lips together, trying to hold it in, but my body wouldn't listen. I felt ashamed and angry for crying. Angry that he wasn't here to see it anymore. Angry that he had taken with him all the answers I still needed. A hand touched my shoulder. It was my Aunt Clara. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me with teary eyes and squeezed me lightly. "He loved you, in a twisted way, but he loved you," she whispered. I didn't answer. It was just another one of those things people say when they don't know what to say. That night, I went home and sat on the living room floor, where the smell of aged wood seemed to merge with the memories. I picked up the only photo I had of my father when he was young. He must have been in his early 20s. He was standing next to his grandfather, my grandfather, the true monster of the family. The man who made my father bleed until he became the shadow he was. I remembered the time my father came home drunk and kicked my bedroom door down. He said he wanted to teach me to be strong, that crying was for weak people, that getting hit was a part of life. But in his eyes in that photo, there was something else. There was fear, an old fear, deep fear, a fear he never knew how to name and that he may never have overcome. In the days following the wake, I delved into boxes of old papers my aunt had saved. Letters, notebooks, notes. I found a note he had never given me. It was from 1998. I was 8 years old. Today I hit him again. I don't want to be that man, but when I look into his eyes, I feel my father's gaze, and everything goes dark. The words were shaky, stained, and that made me fall apart again. Not from the pain of being hit, but from his pain. From the silent tragedy of a man who repeated what he suffered, never knowing how to escape. The next week, I went back to the house where I grew up. The same one he never sold, even after my mother left. It was dusty, as if time had stopped in there. I went to his room. A shirt was still hanging on the back of the door. His scent lingered there like a ghost that refused to leave. I sat on the bed and closed my eyes. I saw myself, small, sitting on the floor, listening to him fight with the radio because the announcer said his team was going to lose. I saw myself hiding behind the curtain, listening to my own muffled sobs. But now, looking at it all from the outside, I saw something else too, the desperation of a man who never learned to love because he was never loved. And it was there, in that bed that I hated so much, that I understood what forgiveness was. Not a hug, not an apology, not reconciliation. Forgiveness was stopping carrying hate as armor. It was stopping feeding the wounded child who was still waiting for a gesture that would never come. But before I could breathe a sigh of relief, I heard a noise coming from the basement. The old wooden stairs creaked, and in that moment, with the hairs on my arms standing on end, I realized that there was something in this house that hadn't yet been buried with him. I walked down the basement steps with the care of someone treading on memories. Each floorboard creaked as if to protest my presence, as if to say I shouldn't be there. It was a place I had avoided since childhood. The basement of our house wasn't just dark, it held a presence, a heaviness in the air, as if the walls had witnessed too much. Whenever my father disappeared for hours, this was where he would hide. He would come back smelling of alcohol, his eyes glazed over and sometimes with bloody knuckles. I never knew exactly what he did in that place, but my mother said he kept demons down there. Now, perhaps I understood what she meant. The light switch on the wall didn't work. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining the flickering beam into the darkness. The smell of mold and damp wood was strong. There were boxes piled high, old furniture covered in drop cloths, and in the far corner, a rusty metal bookcase. As I approached, I noticed a leather briefcase on the floor, covered in thick dust. I knelt down and carefully opened it. Inside, I found something that made my chest tighten. Dozens of cassette tapes. Each one was marked with a date and a name. Some of the names were familiar, neighbors' names, uncles' names, even my own. I took 2 of them upstairs with me, along with an old tape recorder that was also there. After cleaning the machine, I put in the first tape and pressed play. A hissing sound filled the room, and then his voice. My father's voice. But it wasn't as I remembered it. It wasn't the voice of a man shouting, furious. It was low, hesitant. Today was another hard day. He looked at me with fear. I saw it in his eyes, just like I looked at my father. He paused for long moments. He took deep breaths between sentences. I swore it wouldn't be like this. But sometimes the blood boils and I can't see anything anymore. Then there's only silence. And shame, always shame. My eyes filled with tears. Hearing that was like seeing the other side of the mirror, the side I never wanted to see. I put in the second tape. He was talking about me, his voice shaking. He's smart, you know, much smarter than I am. And that scares me, because I don't know how to teach him to be a man without doing what my father did to me, but it's all I know, all I have left in me. His voice broke at the end. He was crying. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the mattress sink under the weight of memories that came back like ghosts. I tried to imagine my father, alone in that basement, speaking into a tape as if it were his only confessional. He never asked me for forgiveness. He never looked me in the eye and acknowledged what he had done. But there, on those tapes, I saw a man desperately trying to hold on to anything that would keep him from sinking. Over the next few days, I listened to tape after tape. It was a painful diary. And as his voices became more fragile, more human, a new emotion was born in me. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it wasn't hate anymore either. It was something in between, something that felt like the beginning of a release. I spoke to my mother again, after years of silence. She now lived in a small town, surrounded by flowers and cats. When I arrived, she hugged me as if no time had passed. She told me things she had never told me before. That my father was different when he was young. That he laughed out loud, wrote poems, made plans. But that after his father died, something changed. He started drinking. He started keeping quiet. He started carrying the fury of the world on his shoulders. He wasn't bad, son. He was just too broken to know how to love, she said, her eyes sad but not resentful. I stayed as long as I could, but when I saw that you were going to break with me, I left. We were silent for long minutes, and for the first time, I felt that there was no one left to hate. That hatred, in the end, was just a cry from the part of me that wanted to understand why I never felt loved. On the way back, I decided I would burn the tapes, not because I wanted to erase what I had heard, but because I wanted to leave it all there, in the past. I built a bonfire in the backyard of the old house. One by one, I threw the cassettes into the flames. The plastic crackled and the smell was strong. But as the tapes disappeared, I felt something inside me calming down, as if the child inside me for the first time was being welcomed by myself. The next morning, an envelope was placed under my door. There was no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with handwriting I recognized immediately. It was my father's handwriting. The letter was dated 3 days before his death. It simply said, "If you're reading this, it's because you've already buried me. I know I don't deserve tears, I know what I was. But if by some miracle you cried, thank you, because that means that somewhere you still carry the part of me that tried to be better." And then, for the first time, I smiled, because I finally understood that forgiveness is not about the other person. It is about freeing the child who still waits for a love that never came. And in that moment, I hugged her. But when I walked into the house, something made me freeze. In the hallway, on the wooden table, there was a new cassette tape, one that I hadn't left there. I stood at the table, staring at the tape as if it were a cursed artifact. My breath caught in my throat. It was impossible. I had burned them all. I had carried each one to the fire myself. I watched as they melted in the flames. How had this one gotten there? I picked it up with shaking hands. It was warm, as if it had been left there recently. There was no title, no date. Just the tape, silent, ominous in its mere existence. I took her to the tape recorder, which I hadn't put away yet. I sat on the floor in the living room where so many memories had crushed me over the past few nights. The click of the play button was like the sound of a door closing behind me. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then a distant hiss, followed by heavy breathing, and then a voice. But it wasn't my father's, it was mine, my voice as a child. "Dad, are you there? I drew the picture, okay?" The tape continued, a sound of footsteps. Something fell, and then a muffled scream, the sound of a slap. My crying. I must have been about 5 years old at the time of the recording. I had completely forgotten about that moment. But now it all came back. The smell of paint, the crayon drawing, me handing it to him, and the slap that came after, when he saw that I had drawn a monster and written underneath, "This is Daddy." I stopped the tape with a shudder. My fingers were shaking. There was a metallic taste in my mouth. That tape wasn't a confession. It was an open wound, a record of something I wanted to forget. How had it survived? Who had left it there? And why? In the days that followed, something inside me began to crumble. That tape was different from the others. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness, nor an outburst. It was an exposed scar. I went back to my mother's house and asked if she knew of any recordings I had made, if he had ever recorded our moments. She just shook her head, confused. He recorded everything, even himself while he was sleeping. He said that silence said more than he could explain in words. Her words echoed in my mind. Silence said more than words. That same night, I went back to the empty house and sat in the basement again. There were more boxes which I hadn't touched before. I decided to open one of them. Inside were notebooks with my drawings. I didn't even remember making so many. And next to it, a diary with notes in code. He marked them with symbols: a star, a circle, a cross. Pages and pages of that, and an envelope at the bottom of the box with my name on it. Inside, a letter, written in anger, scratched out, riddled with regret. You were the only good thing I ever did in my life, but I ruined that too. You looked at me with clear eyes and I saw the reflection of what I could never be. I broke you, and yet, you came back. The words hit me like knives. I wondered why he hadn't told me this when he was alive, why he waited until death to try to be human. But maybe it was because it was only at the end that he was able to see something beyond his own pain. I decided to listen to the tape until the end. I went back to the recorder, took a deep breath and pressed play. After the child's crying, there was a long pause. Then, his voice appeared like a whisper in the background. If you ever hear this, know that I saw it. I saw the cartoon, and I cried after you fell asleep, because that's exactly how I felt inside. A monster. I cringed at that. I didn't know what to do with this pain, because now it was both of ours. It was shared. It was a curse cycle that repeated itself from generation to generation. And I wanted to break it. I didn't want to be another continuation of the pain. The next morning I went to the cemetery. I took the tape recorder and the letter with me. I sat on the damp ground in front of his simple headstone. I didn't say much. I just left the letter there, folded neatly, and the tape recorder with the tape. I buried them both with my bare hands in the earth beside him. It was my ritual farewell, my symbolic end, my act of liberation. When I got home, I left the windows open. I let the air in. I threw away old clothes, dusty books, rotten memories. I wanted to start over, and I did. From that moment on, I did something I never imagined. I started writing. I wrote about pain, about anger, about unrequited love, about the boy who drew monsters but wanted heroes. Every word was a tear I didn't shed as a child. Every paragraph was a hug I never received. And as I wrote, I realized that somehow I was no longer alone. A month later, I published my first text on an anonymous reporting website. I didn't expect a response, but I received one. Hundreds. From people who also hated their parents or who loved them very much despite everything. Broken people, silent people, people like me. And among the messages, one caught my attention. It was short, no name, no face. It just said, "The tape you found, I left it. I thought you deserved to remember, because we only face the monster when we look back." I stood motionless for minutes. That message reopened questions. Who wrote it? How did they know about the tape? And why? Why now? But something inside me told me it wasn't time to have all the answers. Because perhaps the most important thing had already happened. I no longer cried for him. I cried for myself, for the child I had been, for the pain I had carried. But for the first time, I also cried for relief, because I could finally breathe without the weight of anger. Until one cold night, I accidentally knocked into a bookshelf and an old book fell out. Inside, it was a photo I had never seen before. It was my father, with a baby in his arms, me. Behind the photo, a handwritten date and a note. That day, for a moment, I thought it could be better. But what was next to the photo sent chills down my spine. A keychain with the symbol of a cross, the same one from the coded notes in the notebooks in the basement, and inside it, an address. I spent the whole night staring at the keychain with the cross symbol. It was small, made of aged metal, like something that had passed through many hands and years. The embossed symbol was the same one my father used to obsessively draw in his notebooks in the basement. I always thought it was just a habit, a meaningless repetition. But now, next to the photo, with that note and an address inside, it became a clue. A half-open door to a secret he never told, or never had the courage to tell. The address was on a street in another town, 60 miles away. A small, rural town, the kind where everyone knows everyone else's name and faces grow old without being forgotten. I drove in late the next morning. The road wound through hills and fields, and the radio played some random song that seemed to dissolve into the roar of the engine. The whole way there, my heart was bouncing between anxiety and fear. Fear of discovering more than I was ready to know. Fear of looking back with new eyes and seeing something that would change everything all over again. I arrived at the address early in the afternoon. It was a simple house with a wooden fence that had faded with time. There was a porch with 2 rocking chairs. The door was ajar, as if it were waiting for me. I rang the doorbell, but no one answered. I waited a while, and when I turned to leave, a soft voice called me from inside. "You came." It was a lady with white hair and very light eyes. It took longer than I expected. I was speechless. "Do you know me?" She nodded with a sad smile. "I knew your father. Many years ago. He told me that perhaps one day you would show up. He left me an envelope to give to you. Only if you came of your own free will." I entered the house with her silent permission. The place was clean, smelling of tea and lavender. The lady, who introduced herself as Elena, led me into a room lit by a large window. We sat down. She handed me a thick envelope, sealed with wax. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were several handwritten pages. They were excerpts from a kind of diary, but not like the ones I had found before. These were organized, almost literary, and they told of a time in my father's life that I had never heard of before. A time when he had tried to get treatment. A time when he had been to this place, a former recovery home for men with a history of violence and family trauma. The cross on the keychain was the symbol of the program. Not a religious symbol, but a mark of recognition among those trying to break the cycle. My father had been there for months. In one of the excerpts he wrote, "Today, I managed to go 3 days without yelling at anyone. It doesn't seem like much, but it's a lot for me. For the first time, I was able to listen without exploding. They say anger comes from fear. If that's true, then I'm just a man afraid to love." Reading it hit me like a bolt of lightning. I never knew that. I never knew he tried. I never knew he wanted to change. That at some point, however brief, he sought redemption. He couldn't finish the program, Elena said. He disappeared suddenly. One day he just disappeared, but he left this. He said that maybe one day his son would come here, and that you needed to know that he wasn't just the one who hurt you, that he had tried. I looked at her, moved. He never talked about it. He never showed it, because he was ashamed, because he thought you wouldn't forgive him, and maybe because he didn't forgive himself. I left the house with my mind in turmoil. That new play changed everything. I wondered what had happened to make him abandon his attempt to heal. What had pushed him back into the abyss? And why had he hidden it so well? I drove back with my head full. When I got home, night had already fallen. I sat on the couch with the pages still in my hands, rereading passages, trying to put together a puzzle of someone who, perhaps not even he, knew who he was completely. But then, a thought struck me. I pulled out the notebooks from the basement and went back to studying the symbols. Crosses, Stars, circles. I began to notice patterns. The dates matched specific accounts, and I noticed that in the margins he was counting, lines crossed out in groups of 5, like markers for days. Days without outbursts, without drinking. Were they records of emotional abstinence? With each broken cycle, he returned to the cross, the starting mark. I stayed up all night connecting it. I began to see the map of his mind, the dance of trying and failing, the struggle between the man he wanted to love and the monster shaped by his own past. And then, at the bottom of one of the boxes, I found something else, an old photograph, a group of men in a circle. In the center, my father, younger, with a look in his eyes that I had never seen before. Could it be hope? Behind the photo, a phrase written in red: "Those who burn the bridge to the past also lose their way back." That hit me like a punch, because maybe he didn't come back to the show, because he thought there was no going back, because maybe after everything he'd done, he thought forgiveness was a closed road, that he didn't deserve redemption. The following week, I returned to Elena's house. She greeted me with a silent hug. "There's something else," she said. "He left it, but he asked me to keep it until you were ready." She handed me a small key. "It's in the old closet in his room, here at home." I locked it like he asked. "It's all there." I followed her up to the bedroom. The closet was made of dark wood, sturdy, and smelled of things that had been stored there for decades. I opened it with the key. Inside was a wooden box with a glass lid. And there, a letter. But not only that. Next to the letter was an old tape recorder with the last tape he had recorded. And on the handwritten note next to the tape, "Don't press play unless you're ready to hear the whole thing." I sat on the edge of the bed, the tape recorder heavy in my hands as if it carried the weight of 2 generations. The tape inside seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. The warning written next to it, "Do not press play unless you are ready to hear the whole thing," was more than a sentence. It was a test, a line that, once crossed, would be one of no return. I took a deep breath. I looked around the silent room, the simple furniture, the curtains dancing in the wind that came through the open window. Everything there seemed frozen in time, as if this place held the last trace of a man who spent his life trying to rebuild himself in silence. I pressed the button. The tape began with a familiar wheeze, followed by a faint cough, and then his voice. Raspy, tired, but different from the other recordings. It was cleaner, more aware. "If you're listening to this, then I'm gone. And maybe you're angry that you found this now. Maybe you think it's just another cowardly attempt to explain myself. But this tape, it's not an apology. It's the end of the story. The end I never had the courage to tell you." He paused for a moment. The silence seemed to swallow everything around him. Then he continued, "I know what I did, and I know that even if you forgive me, it will hurt. I carry that with me every day. But there's something you don't know. Something I buried so deep that for a long time I thought I had killed it. But the truth always comes back, and that's what I need to tell you about." My heart raced. I had no idea what was coming. I thought I had it all figured out. I thought the monsters already had names. But he continued, "You always thought I became violent because of what I experienced with my father. And it's true. He destroyed me. He broke me as a boy. But there was something else. Something that ate away at me inside. A secret. A guilt. Something that turned me into something worse." The voice failed. A metallic noise filled the next few seconds. And then, "When you were 3, your mom had to go to the hospital. We were home alone for a whole weekend. I was sober. I wanted to do everything right. Make you pancakes, play games, be the father I never had. But that night, I lost it. You were crying so hard. You had a fever. And I screamed. I shook you hard. And you fell. You hit your head on the corner of the bed. You were unconscious for a few seconds." The words mixed with the sound of my own blood pounding in my ears. I sat up with a start. I almost stopped the tape, but no, I needed to hear it. "You woke up soon after. I cried more than you did. I blamed myself so much that the next day I called your mother and told her you had fallen on your own. She believed me. And you never remembered. Or maybe you buried it as deep as I did." I sat on the floor, my hands shaking. A vague memory flashed through me. A flash. Dim light, blurred vision. The sound of someone shouting my name. An arm shaking me. I always thought it was a nightmare. He continued, "That's when I knew I couldn't be a father, not the right way, because there was something inside me that was so broken. And no matter how hard I tried to fix it, something kept pulling me back. I hated myself for it. And maybe that's why. It made you hate me too, because it was easier to deal with your hate than your compassion." The tape continued for a few more minutes, with interspersed clips, fragments of memories. He remembered moments I had forgotten, when he taught me to ride a bike, when he gave me a handmade gift and I broke it the same day. Small attempts I never acknowledged. But there, for the first time, I saw my father as a man trying desperately not to sink. If I could go back, I would have yelled less, hugged you more. I would have told you I loved you. But I was a coward. And deep down, I was afraid that if you saw who I really was, you would hate me too. The last words came after a long pause. But if you're still there, listening until now, thank you. Because that means you didn't erase me. And even if you don't forgive me, knowing that you heard me is already more than I deserved." The click of the end of the tape cut through the air like a blade. I stood there, motionless. The recorder made a brief hiss before going silent. I closed my eyes. I felt a cry stuck in my throat, different from the others. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was mourning for everything we didn't experience, for all the buried possibilities. That night, I went to the beach. I needed air. I needed wind. I needed a horizon that wasn't made of memories. I walked to the rocks. And there, alone, I said out loud what I had never said in life. "I forgive you." Not because he deserved it, but because I deserved it. And for a moment, I felt the weight of my childhood crumble in the wind. When I got home, something was waiting for me at the door. A brown envelope with no return address. Inside, there was only a sentence printed on a white sheet. "No monster is born a monster alone." And below, a geographic coordinate. I wrote down the coordinates and spent hours staring at that spot on the map. It was an isolated spot, on the edge of a nearly forgotten village, nestled between mountains and valleys that seemed out of time. Why would my father take me there? What else was there to discover? For days I hesitated. There was too much I had already unearthed, memories that hurt, truths that tore me apart, voices from a past I swore I had buried. But part of me knew, if I didn't see it through, this cycle would never truly end. I traveled on a cloudy weekend. The road was winding, lonely, surrounded by dry trees. When I arrived at the exact location indicated by the coordinates, I found a narrow, abandoned trail, almost hidden by vegetation. I walked for about 30 minutes until I saw an old stone building. It looked like an abandoned chapel with broken windows and half-open doors. The place exuded solitude, but also silence. A silence that did not weigh on me, only waited. I walked in slowly. In the center, there was an altar covered in dust. Behind it, a bench with marks of use, and on the bench, a metal box. When I opened it, I found only one thing, a notebook. The cover was worn, the elastic loose, but inside were the hardest and most beautiful words my father had ever said out loud. It was a long letter, written over the years, in parts, not addressed to me directly, but to the idea of me, to the son he wanted to deserve, to the man he hoped would one day rise from his own ashes. And there he wrote what he had never had the courage to say. You were my salvation and my sentence. Every time I looked at you, I saw what I could have been. And it broke me, because I knew that at the same time I loved you, I was hurting you. There is no greater pain than knowing that you are the very poison of the one you love the most. I continued reading page by page as if I were going through an emotional labyrinth. He spoke of sleepless nights, of dreams where he asked me for forgiveness as a child, of times when he thought about disappearing, but stayed just to try to be better one day. And at the end of the notebook, a single paragraph underlined, forgiveness is not about the other person. It is about freeing the child who still waits for a love that never came. I closed the notebook with tears streaming down my face. I was no longer a broken son holding the ruins of his father. I was a whole man, looking back with compassion. I finally understood that my father was not just the man who shouted, who hit, who hurt. He was also the man who tried, who failed, yes, but who, somewhere, loved. I returned home feeling light. For the first time in decades, I no longer carried that ancestral anger. And what's more, I was ready to live. Months later, I published a book with the story. I changed the names, I changed the places, but I kept the soul. I called it The Day I Cried at the Wake of the Man I Hated. And in the preface I wrote, this is not a story about pain. It's about what we do with it. It's about how we survive those who have hurt us, and how sometimes survival is also a form of love. The book found hurting people like me. I received letters from children, fathers, mothers, grandchildren, people who understood that forgiveness does not mean forgetting or justifying. It means interrupting, stopping the cycle, offering yourself the peace that the other person could never give. Today, I carry on. I carry the scars with me, but not the weight. I love differently. I speak when it hurts. I listen when someone cries, because I know what it's like to scream in the dark and get no answer. And if there's someone today who calls me father, I promise to be for them what my father couldn't be for me. Not because I'm better, but because I had the courage to see the man behind the monster, and understand that sometimes monsters are just children who never learned to love. And when I think about my father, I don't feel hate anymore. I miss it, of who he tried to be. And in the end, that's enough. End.